There is a certain kind of person who never raises their voice, not because they have nothing to say, not because they lack the anger or the conviction or the deep and justified outrage that louder people carry so visibly on their faces, but because they learned earlier than most people learn anything important, that raising your voice is a luxury that belongs to people who can afford to be noticed. People who walk into a room and the room makes space for them automatically, the way water parts for something large and certain of itself. Those people never had to learn the particular discipline of the person who cannot afford to be noticed in the wrong way. That discipline has a name, although we rarely call it by one. We just call it intelligence, or wit, or political instinct, or social grace. We say someone is good at reading a room without stopping to ask why they became so good at it, without asking what happened to them in all the rooms before this one, without asking what it cost them to develop that skill and whether they would have chosen to pay that cost if anyone had asked them. Nobody ever asks. That's the first thing to understand about the kind of person we're going to spend time with tonight. Nobody ever asked. Settle in. Let the room around you recede into the background, the way rooms do when you stop actively looking at them. Let your body find its own weight. Let your thoughts slow from whatever speed they've been running at today. And I suspect they've been running quite fast, because that's the nature of days. They tend to accumulate momentum and let them begin to drop towards something slower, something quieter, something that moves at the pace of candlelight rather than electricity. We are going to descend tonight into a particular mind. A mind that was never supposed to be powerful and became powerful anyway. A mind that was shaped by rejection, the way a coastline is shaped by water, not destroyed by it, but carved into something very specific. Something that could not have taken that exact shape without exactly that force applied over exactly that amount of time. A mind full of wine and wit and grief and genuine, complicated, stubbornly persistent love. We are going to sit with Tyrion Lannister, not as a plot, not as a sequence of events in a fantasy story that you may or may not know, but as a mind, as a human configuration, as a way of being in the world that is not fiction at all, that is instead one of the oldest and most recognizable human shapes there is. The shape of the person who learned to think their way through everything, because thinking was the only door left open. Take a breath. We'll go slowly. Before we say much about him specifically, let's build the world he inhabited. Because minds don't exist in isolation. They exist inside conditions. They are produced by conditions. And the conditions that produced Tyrion Lannister are worth understanding, not as backstory, but as architecture, as the actual structure within which a particular kind of consciousness had to form itself. Imagine a world organized almost entirely around two things: blood and appearance. By blood, I mean lineage, who your parents were, what name you carry. What story that name tells before you've opened your mouth, before you've done a single thing either good or bad, before you've had the chance to be anyone at all. In this world, your name is a verdict issued at birth. Some names say, "You belong here. You were meant for this." The resources and the deference and the rooms with fires in them are yours by right. Other names say something more complicated. And some names say, "You are a problem." By appearance, I mean exactly that. How you look, whether you conform to the particular physical ideal that a given society has decided represents power, or virtue, or legitimacy. Whether your body fits the shape that the story says a hero's body should take. Whether you can walk into a room and have the room confirm, just from looking at you, all the things you wanted to believe about you. In a world organized around those two things, blood and appearance, Tyrion Lannister was an extraordinary contradiction. His blood was as fine as blood got. The Lannisters were one of the great houses of Westeros, rulers of a vast, wealthy region, famously proud, famously golden, famously rich in a way that had become almost a cultural shorthand. The Lannisters paid their debts. The gold of Casterly Rock ran like a river. The family was synonymous with a particular kind of magnificent, slightly terrifying power. To be a Lannister was to arrive already elevated, already significant, already in the accounting of that world worth something. But Tyrion's appearance was everything that appearance wasn't supposed to be, in a world that cared so much about it. He was born a dwarf, short and disproportionate, with mismatched eyes and a large head, and the particular way of moving that comes from having a body that doesn't quite match the dimensions of the world that was built without it in mind. From the moment he arrived in the world, which was also, notably, the moment his mother left it, which we will return to, the visual contradiction was complete. This name, this body, these two things set against each other like a riddle without an answer. And the family around him, rather than working to resolve the riddle in any productive or compassionate way, mostly just stared at it. Some with contempt, some with pity, some with a kind of clinical discomfort, as if the riddle were a breach of etiquette, as if by existing in this particular combination, the child had already committed a social offense that required management. This is the world Tyrion was born into. Not the dragons, not the political intrigue, not the vast geopolitical machinery of a continent organizing and reorganizing itself around questions of power. Those things came later. First, there was just this. A child in a castle. A contradiction in a family that despised contradiction. A mind beginning to orient itself around a set of conditions that were going to require very specific adaptations if it was going to survive intact. And the mind, as minds do, as minds always do, because the particular genius of human consciousness is its capacity to adapt, began to orient itself. Let's watch it do that. Let's follow it, slowly and carefully, from the beginning. He was born into winter, in a sense that had nothing to do with the seasons. His mother, Joanna Lannister, died in childbed. This is a fact that the narrative of Tyrion's life tends to mention and then move past, because there are so many other dramatic facts competing for attention. But let's not move past it. Let's stay with it for a moment, because it is, in some ways, the first and most foundational fact of everything that follows. A child arrives in the world. The mother does not survive the arrival. This happens. It happened with painful frequency in the world of the story, and with painful frequency in the actual medieval world that the story draws from, and it is always terrible. But there is a specific additional cruelty in what happened next. Because the people around Tyrion, his father, his sister, in quieter and more diffuse ways, the entire household, made an association, made a connection between the death and the child, as if the one had caused the other, as if the unusual nature of the birth, the difficult labor, the small, strange child that emerged, were a sufficient explanation for the catastrophe of the mother's death. The child killed her. Nobody said it in those exact words, probably. These things rarely get said in exact words. They get communicated in the quality of attention you receive, in the way your father looks at you or doesn't look at you, in the way people in the household speak around you rather than to you, in the very specific silence that descends in a room when you enter it. A silence that is not the silence of welcome, but the silence of a conversation that was happening before you arrived and will resume after you leave. Children read those silences with extraordinary accuracy. They don't have the vocabulary for what they're reading. They don't have the analytical framework, but they have the sensitivity, the raw, unfiltered sensitivity of a creature that is entirely dependent on the adults around it, and therefore has very high incentives to monitor those adults very carefully. And what Tyrion monitored, from the earliest age at which monitoring becomes possible, was a kind of ambient cold, a warmth withheld, an embrace that never quite happened. His father, Tyrion Lannister, was not a cruel man in the simple sense. He was not sadistic. He did not take pleasure in others' suffering in the transparent way that some powerful men do. He was something more complicated and in some ways more difficult to navigate. He was a man for whom control was everything, for whom the management of appearances, the careful, continuous presentation of the Lannister family as an edifice of power and pride and correct proportion, was as close to a religion as he ever got. And Tyrion was unmanageable, not in the obvious sense, not disruptive or rebellious or difficult in any of the ways that children can be difficult, that can eventually be corrected. He was unmanageable in a deeper, more irresolvable way, just by being what he was, just by existing in the form he existed in. Every time someone looked at him, the Lannister edifice developed a visible crack. Every time he walked into a room full of people who knew his name, the gap between what the name promised and what the body delivered was immediately legible. Tywin found this intolerable. Not Tyrion. Tyrion himself, the actual child, the actual mind developing inside that body, seems to have been largely invisible to his father. What Tywin reacted to, what generated the cold and the distance, and the very specific quality of contempt that he extended toward his youngest child, was not Tyrion the person. It was the symbolic problem Tyrion represented. The disruption, the embarrassment, the evidence that the Lannister machinery could produce something that the Lannister story couldn't accommodate. That distinction, being responded to not as yourself, but as what you represent, is a particular kind of psychological injury, because it forecloses, from the beginning, the possibility of resolution through self-improvement. You cannot fix a symbolic problem by becoming a better person. You cannot work your way out of being someone's embarrassment by demonstrating competence or kindness or the genuine intelligence that you are in fact demonstrating almost constantly. Because the thing they object to isn't anything you did, it's what you are. And what you are is not available for revision. The child Tyrion must have understood this, in whatever pre-verbal way young children understand the fundamental dynamics of their lives, quite early, and he made adjustments. The first adjustment was to books. He read everything. He read histories and travelers' accounts and military manuals and philosophical treatises, and, when he could get them, the kind of racy, entertaining literature that nobody in a respectable household would admit to enjoying. He read not just because reading was pleasant, though it was deeply pleasant. It was one of the only places where his mind could move at its actual speed without encountering the drag of everyone else's expectations. But because reading was the one kind of consumption that nobody could take away from him or use against him, a Lannister lord's son reading in the library is not a pathetic figure. A Lannister lord's son doing almost anything else in the mismatched body that made everyone uncomfortable was always, at some level, exposed. In the library, the books didn't see the body. He also learned to talk. Not just to speak, he could speak from the time he could speak, but to talk, to deploy language as a tool, to understand the particular physics of conversation, which is that words are never just words. They are moves. They position the speakers relative to each other. They establish the terms on which this particular interaction is going to be conducted. And the person who establishes those terms first, who sets the frame, who decides whether this is going to be a conversation about what I've done or about what you've been thinking, that person has a significant advantage. Tyrion became, over time, one of the most skilled framers of conversation that anyone around him had ever encountered. He learned to establish the terms so quickly and so naturally that most people didn't notice the terms had been set. They just found themselves in a conversation that felt like it was going somewhere he had chosen, without being able to identify the moment when he chose it. That skill takes years to develop. It takes a very specific kind of practice, the practice of being in rooms where you are not wanted and making yourself worth tolerating anyway, again and again, until you become very good at the very specific art of being worth tolerating. His sister Cersei provided useful practice for this. Cersei was beautiful in the way that certain people are beautiful, comprehensively, effortlessly, in a way that seemed to have been arranged specifically to make the Lannister name make sense. She was everything the story said a Lannister should be, and she knew it from a very young age, and she wore that knowledge the way she wore everything, with a kind of magnificent entitlement that was both entirely real and entirely performance simultaneously. She did not like her younger brother. This was not a casual dislike. It had specificity and history to it. Some part of Cersei, in the private accounting she did of her life, held Tyrion responsible for the loss of her mother. She would not have said so out loud. It was too naked, too illogical, too obviously unfair. But the feeling was there, beneath the surface of her interactions with him, coloring the quality of her contempt with something warmer and more personal than simple disdain. She treated him, mostly, as if he were furniture, as if he occupied space that might be better used for something else. Occasionally, the contempt became more active, more articulate, more specifically pointed. But those moments were almost less painful than the furniture feeling, because at least they acknowledged that he was one of the people who was blessed and loved ones, that he was something worth directing energy toward, even if the energy was hostile. His brother Jaime was entirely different. Jaime loved him, really loved him, without condition or calculation, or the particular Lannister instinct to make everything into a transaction. They played together as children. Jaime included him, defended him, treated him with the easy affection of someone for whom this relationship was simply natural, simply good, simply what brothers were supposed to be for each other. Jaime didn't see the body, or if he saw it, he didn't assign it meaning. He saw the person. This was, for Tyrion, the emotional foundation of his entire life. Not because it was everything he needed. One brother's genuine love is not sufficient armor against a father's contempt, and a sister's hostility, and a world's casual cruelty, but because it was proof. It was evidence that the thing he needed was possible, that he could be loved not despite what he was, but just as what he was, that somewhere in the human social universe, a version of him existed that was receivable, that fit, that belonged. He never stopped wanting that evidence to multiply, never stopped looking in every relationship for the rest of his life for something that felt like what Jaime gave him as a child. The unconditional attention, the unguarded warmth, the simple, radical acceptance of his actual presence. He was often disappointed, but he never stopped. There was a woman when Tyrion was very young, a girl, really, by the standards of the world. Her name was Tysha. She was a commoner, a wheelwright's daughter, and she did something that nobody in Tyrion's life had done in any consistent or trustworthy way. She saw him. Not the name, not the body, not the symbolic problem, not the Lannister heir they wished were different. She saw the person who was reading all those books and learning all those conversational gambits and developing all those skills of observation and analysis. She saw the person underneath the performance, and she responded to that person with warmth, with genuine interest, with something that felt, to someone who had experienced very little of it, startlingly like love. Tyrion married her. Quickly, quietly, without telling his family, which should perhaps have been a signal that he understood, on some level, that the world his family occupied did not have room for this. But he was young, and the warmth was real, and for the first time in his life, he felt something very close to that settled, secure feeling that comes when the world receives you correctly. And then his father found out. What happened next is one of the cruelest things in a story full of cruel things, and it is worth describing carefully, because it illuminates something important about how power operates on the people it has decided to control. Tywin arranged for the marriage to be annulled. He told Tyrion that Tysha had not been who she seemed, that she was not a girl who had genuinely loved him, but a girl who had been paid to perform love. Paid, specifically, by Jaime, as a kindness to his lonely younger brother, as a gift, as the closest thing to real tenderness that the real world would ever offer someone like Tyrion. And then, and here is where cruelty becomes something else, something structural and deliberate and designed to leave a very specific mark. Tywin had Tyrion watch while his guards, one by one, paid the girl for her services, to demonstrate what she had always been, to make it specific, to make it impossible to hold on to any alternative version of events. What Tywin did in that moment was not just cruelty, it was instruction. The instruction was this: you are not someone who gets to have what you thought you had. Whatever warmth the world offered you was purchased. Whatever love you experienced was performance. You are the kind of person things happen to, not the kind of person things happen for. Learn this now. Learn it thoroughly. Learn it in a way that your body remembers, even when your mind tries to forget. The instruction landed. It landed, and it changed things. Not everything. Tyrion was already too intelligent and too fundamentally resilient to be destroyed by any single event, even one this catastrophic. But it changed the particular way he related to love and vulnerability and the possibility of being genuinely known. It installed a kind of interpretive filter through which all subsequent warmth had to pass. Is this real? Is this purchased? Is the person in front of me seeing me, or are they seeing something useful to them? Something they're performing warmth toward, in exchange for some benefit I'm not yet aware of. That filter never fully went away. It made him difficult to love sometimes, not because he was unlovable. He was, in many ways, deeply lovable, possessed of a warmth and a humor and an acute attentiveness to the people around him that is among the most genuinely attractive qualities a person can have. But because he couldn't receive love cleanly, it always passed through the filter. It always arrived at him slightly distorted, slightly suspect, slightly too good to be trusted. And so he did what people do when they can't trust good things. He made sure there was enough of something else. Wine, mostly. Wit. The particular satisfaction of being right in a room full of people who'd rather he weren't. The smaller, more controllable pleasures that couldn't betray him because they made no promises to begin with. He also poured himself into the development of his mind, which was becoming, by his young adulthood, something genuinely remarkable. Not remarkable in the narrow sense, not just clever, not just quick, not just good with words. Remarkable in a wider sense. He had read enough to know that most of what people called wisdom was really just the particular perspective of whoever happened to be in charge. He had navigated enough hostile rooms to understand that the official version of any social situation was almost always a simplification designed to benefit the people who wrote the official version. He had watched enough powerful people up close to know that power and competence were not the same thing, that the people who held authority were frequently not the people best suited to exercise it, and that the gap between those two groups was where most of the tragedy in human organization originated. That knowledge was not comfortable. Comfortable knowledge allows you to operate with some basic faith in the systems around you. Uncomfortable knowledge, the kind that tells you the systems are arbitrary and often broken and maintained primarily by the people who benefit from them, that knowledge is heavy. You can't unknow it. You can't pretend it away. You have to carry it everywhere, into every conversation, into every room. He carried it with considerable grace, mostly. The wine helped. Here's something interesting about Tyrion Lannister and his relationship with power. He wanted it and didn't want it simultaneously, and the two halves of that ambivalence were both completely genuine. He wanted it because power in the world he inhabited was the only available answer to the question of how you survived being what he was. A powerful dwarf was tolerated in rooms that would not tolerate a powerless one. A hand of the king, which he became briefly, commanded a degree of deference that functioned almost like a translation service, converting his physical presence into something that even his enemies had to respond to as significant. Power made him legible to the world in a way that nothing else quite did. But he also didn't want it. Because power in the Lannister world required a particular kind of ruthlessness that Tyrion could perform only partially and at significant personal cost. His father was ruthless in the way that came easily to people who had always been powerful, with a kind of casual inevitability, a sense that the suffering of others in the service of strategic objectives was simply the cost of serious governance, barely worth registering emotionally. Tywin could ruin people without the ruination leaving much of a mark on him. He had made his peace with what power required, and the peace seemed genuine. Tyrion couldn't make that peace, not completely. He had lived too long at the bottom of hierarchies to be entirely comfortable at the top of them. He'd spent too much time being the person that powerful people's decisions landed on, the inconvenience to be managed, the problem to be solved, the symbolic awkwardness to be contained. To take the exercise of power over others lightly. When he wielded power, he felt its weight in both directions. He felt what it did, and he felt, residually, what it was like to have it done to you. That sensitivity made him, paradoxically, a better exerciser of power than most of the people around him. It made him more careful, more attentive to consequences, more willing to think through what a given decision would actually mean for the people it affected, rather than just what it would mean for the strategic objectives of whoever was giving the orders. It also made him slower, more hesitant, more prone to doubt, which in political environments is frequently a liability. The story gives us a very specific moment when his capacity for governance is fully visible. He's made Hand of the King. His nephew Joffrey's regime is a disaster, and King's Landing is a city in crisis. Corrupt, chaotic, running on fear and spite, and the kind of governance that happens when a powerful psychopath has just enough structure around him to prevent immediate collapse while causing slow, steady devastation. Tyrion comes in, reads the situation with extraordinary speed and accuracy, and begins making changes. Some of those changes are ruthless in the strategic sense. He moves pieces on the board that need to be moved, removes obstacles that need to be removed, makes the hard calculations that responsible governance requires. But he does it with an awareness, a continuous, attentive awareness of what is actually happening to actual people. He is not playing a board game. He is making decisions in a city full of human beings who are cold and hungry and frightened, and who need someone to actually govern, not just to perform governance. He genuinely tries. That's worth saying plainly, without qualifications. He genuinely tries, not because he was asked to, not because it would benefit him personally. Being Hand of the King for Joffrey was not, on balance, a position anyone with options would have chosen. But because there are people in trouble, and he is, at this moment, in a position to help, and something in him can't quite let that go to waste. The small folk, that's the word the story uses for them. The ordinary people. The ones with no names in the history books, no positions at court, no ability to influence what happens to them, beyond the ordinary human influence of going about their lives as best they can, while the powerful people make the decisions that shape everything. He thinks about the small folk, consistently, in a way that is unusual among people at his level of the political hierarchy. He thinks about what his decisions will mean for them. He does not always choose correctly. The information is imperfect. The time is short. The pressures are substantial. But he thinks about them. He holds them in mind as real people whose lives are real, whose suffering is real, whose deaths count. This is not a small thing. In the context of the world he inhabits, where the dominant ethic is essentially that the powerful arrange things to benefit themselves, and the suffering of everyone else is ambient background noise. The simple act of thinking about the small folk is something close to a moral stance. He never made speeches about it. He didn't have a philosophy of governance that he articulated and promoted. He just quietly tried to make things slightly less terrible for people who had very little power to make things better for themselves. And then the moment passed, as such moments do. The battle came. He was wounded, almost killed, actually, by one of his own men in one of those specifically horrible moments where the institutional contempt that has surrounded you your whole life becomes literal and physical. And when he recovered, the power was gone. Someone else had taken credit for the victory. The old arrangements had reasserted themselves. The brief window in which his competence had made him indispensable was closed. He went back to being the wrong kind of Lannister. The management of his reaction to this, the performance of not caring, the wine, the wit deployed as a kind of elastic barrier between a genuine feeling and the world that would exploit it, was impeccable. But the feeling was there. Of course it was there. Let's go deep now. Let's go beneath the plot and the politics and the specific incidents and sit for a while with the actual structure of the psychology. Because the structure is the interesting part. The structure is what makes this not just a story about a fictional dwarf in a fantasy kingdom, but a map of something much wider. What does it actually do to a person to be comprehensively misread? Not occasionally. Not in the way that all people are occasionally misread, which is a normal part of social life that most people navigate without long-term damage, but comprehensively, systematically, as a condition rather than an incident. The experience of being systematically misread creates a very specific kind of split in a person's psychology. On one side of the split, there is the public self, the self that has been shaped by the misreading, that has adapted to the conditions created by the misreading, that has built its strategies and its armor and its performances in direct response to what the world has consistently gotten wrong about it. On the other side, there is something quieter and more private, something that knows the misreading is wrong, that holds somewhere the correct version of the story. The public self of Tyrion Lannister is extraordinarily developed. It is one of the most sophisticated public selves in the story, constantly active, constantly monitoring, constantly calibrating the output to match the specific demands of whatever room he is in. The wit, the self-deprecation, the casual references to his own monstrousness, the way he manages other people's discomfort with his presence by making the discomfort into a joke before they've had time to make it into something hostile. All of this is the public self, running continuously, burning through a significant portion of the total available energy. The private self is much less visible. It shows up in unguarded moments, in the way his face changes when he's genuinely interested in something, when an idea catches him, when a book he's reading touches something live in him, when a genuine human exchange breaks through the performance and actual contact occurs. In those moments, for a few seconds, you can see someone entirely different from the public performance. Someone younger seeming, somehow. Someone who had not yet learned to manage. The split between those two selves is where most of his suffering actually lived. Not in the external events, the trials, the escapes, the losses, the exiles. Those are the occasions for suffering, but they are not its source. Its source was the internal gap, the distance between what he knew about himself and what the world insisted he was. The energy required to manage that gap continuously for decades. There is a psychological concept that describes what happens to people who experience sustained invalidation. The repeated experience of having their perceptions, feelings, and sense of self denied or dismissed by the people around them. It is not a simple experience, and it does not produce simple effects. What it produces over time is a particular kind of hypervigilance, an intense attentiveness to the external world, to what other people are feeling, to what the room is doing, to what the next threat might be, paired with a corresponding neglect of the internal world. Because the internal world has been a source of pain and confusion, because attending to it too closely produces information that there's no safe outlet for. Because the public performance requires most of the available bandwidth, and something has to be turned down to make room. What gets turned down typically is the self-knowledge, the accurate perception of your own needs, your own feelings, your own worth. Tyrion was extraordinary at reading other people and had significant blind spots about himself. He could tell you with startling precision what motivated the person he was negotiating with, what they feared, what they wanted, what they would accept, what would make them feel that they had won, even when they had lost. He could map the emotional terrain of a room within minutes of entering it, could identify the dynamics and the tensions and the particular configuration of who was afraid of whom, who was pretending what, who needed to be managed, and how. But he consistently undervalued his own contributions, consistently assumed the worst about his own prospects, consistently reached in his quieter moments for explanations that placed the cause of his difficulties inside himself, in some inherent deficiency, some fundamental flaw, rather than in the structural and interpersonal conditions that were actually creating them. This is not a character weakness, exactly. It's the predictable outcome of the conditions he was raised in. When the people with the most power over your early development are consistently telling you that you are the problem, that your existence is the source of difficulty, that things would be better without you. When that message is delivered with sufficient consistency and authority, it installs itself. It becomes the default interpretation, the filter through which you read events, the explanation you reach for first when things go wrong. He fought this. He was too intelligent not to fight it. He could identify it in himself sometimes and hold it at a distance. He could distinguish between this bad thing is happening because I am fundamentally deficient, and this bad thing is happening because the world is structured in ways that regularly produce bad outcomes for people in my position. He could make that distinction intellectually, but in the dark hours, and there were many dark hours, most of them solitary, most of them accompanied by wine, the intellectual distinction didn't always hold. The old interpretation crept back in, the familiar verdict delivered by the familiar voice in the familiar tone of absolute authority. You are the problem. You have always been the problem. The world's discomfort is your fault. He lived with that voice for his entire life, argued with it, drank to quiet it. Occasionally, and brilliantly, used the energy of arguing with it to to do genuinely useful things in the world, but never fully silenced it, because you can't fully silence the voice of your father, even when he's gone, even when you understand with your full adult intelligence that the voice was wrong, even when you have accumulated sufficient evidence to demolish the voice's central claims several times over. It's still there, doing its patient, tireless work. Let's stay in the psychological territory for a while longer, because there's something specific about the use of humor that deserves more than a passing mention, because humor is not simple. Humor is one of the most sophisticated cognitive and social operations that human beings perform, and its relationship to pain and survival is far more complicated than the easy formulation, "He's funny because he's sad," would suggest. Tyrion's humor works on several levels simultaneously, and it's worth looking at each one. The first level is the most visible: humor as social management, as the tool that controls the frame of any given interaction. When Tyrion makes a joke about his own height, or his own monstrousness, or his own dubious parentage, he is performing something very specific. He is establishing that this is a domain over which he has control. He got there first. The punchline belongs to him, and because it belongs to him, it cannot be used against him by someone else. Or if they try to use it, they discover that they're arriving late to a party that he threw and left before they got there. This is not a small thing. In social environments where physical vulnerability is real, where the contempt people feel for you might, at any moment, become something more actionable than contempt, controlling the comedic frame of the interaction is a form of actual defense. It is not merely psychological armor. It has physical consequences. A room that is laughing with you is a room that is not doing the other thing. The second level is more internal: humor as a processing tool. The capacity to make something funny is, at its core, the capacity to perceive it from a distance, to hold the painful or frightening or humiliating thing at arm's length for long enough to reshape it into something that can be presented to a social audience as entertainment rather than wound. That reframing is genuinely useful internally. It produces real cognitive distance. It creates a moment in which the thing that was happening to you becomes, briefly, a thing you are observing, a performance you are giving rather than an experience you are having. The problem, and this is the part that doesn't usually get discussed, is that the distance required to make the joke is also the distance required to not fully feel the thing. And not fully feeling it means not processing it, not integrating it, not integrating it, not reaching the point where it loses its charge and becomes simply part of the past rather than an active presence in the present. Tyrion's humor was constant enough and sufficiently comprehensive in its application that he may never have fully processed some of the central experiences of his life. The loss of Tysha, the sustained contempt of his father, the specific shape of the loneliness that came from being too intelligent to be fully fooled by anything, and too human to be fully comfortable with that. Those things were always there, waiting with the patience of unprocessed experience for a moment when the performance was down and the wine wasn't working, and the room was empty, and the voice in the dark was the only company available. The third level is what might be called humor as generosity, because Tyrion's humor, at its best, was not only self-directed or self-protective, it was genuinely given to the people around him. He made people laugh. Real laughter, not the nervous laughter of people performing amusement at someone they're afraid of, but genuine, surprised, delighted laughter. The kind that releases something, that makes the room feel, briefly, that is a gift. That is a gift. It takes real skill to give it. It requires a genuine attentiveness to the other person, to their state, their needs, their particular configuration of tension and relief in this moment, and the genuine willingness to offer something of yourself in the service of their comfort. In those moments, the humor was not armor. It was something else, something warmer and more exposed, something that looked, if you caught it at the right angle, a lot like love. He was, in his way, very loving. He just couldn't always let it be seen straight on. The story gives Tyrion several significant losses. Let's not list them the way a plot summary would list them. Let's instead think about what loss taught him cumulatively over time. The first lesson loss taught him was that things he loved would be taken. This sounds obvious. Everyone learns, eventually, that things they love can be taken. But there's a difference between learning this as a general truth, the way most people learn it, from a distance, from the examples of others, from the slow understanding that nothing lasts forever, and learning it the way Tyrion learned it, which was up close, and specifically in a way that was clearly directed, in a way that communicated not just that loss was possible, but that his particular attachments were especially vulnerable. That loving something was, for him, specifically, a kind of invitation to have it removed. Tysha was the clearest example, but she was not the only one. There were others, people he attached to, trusted, opened toward, and then lost, usually through some combination of the world's hostility and his own miscalculations, the two being difficult to entirely separate. Over time, this produced a very specific and recognizable pattern. He loved early and deep and with genuine intensity, and then he retreated, made it funny, made himself the butt of the joke about how things had gone, poured wine, got back to work. The second lesson was that his own judgment couldn't be fully trusted. This is a cruel lesson, and I want to be careful about it, because it's important not to slide into the kind of thinking that blames him for the consequences of other people's choices. The fact that Tysha's love was, he was told, manufactured was not a failure of his judgment. It was a manufactured situation created by his father. He was deceived. Being deceived is not the same as having bad judgment, but it felt like bad judgment. It felt like evidence that the internal compass he was relying on, the sense that this person was genuine, this warmth was real, this connection was trustworthy, was not reliable. And once that suspicion was installed, it colored everything. Not always consciously, often just as a slight hesitation, a slight suspension, a full commitment, a slight holding back at the moment when full commitment would be most appropriate. He trusted himself less because of what his father did. That is one of the specific, measurable, lasting damages of Tywin Lannister's treatment of his youngest son. The third lesson, which took longer to arrive and arrived imperfectly and was never fully integrated but was always circling, was this: that the losses, as terrible as they were, had not destroyed him. He was still here, still thinking, and still drinking, still reading, still managing rooms full of hostile people with a level of skill that genuinely surprised even the hostile people. Still, occasionally, despite everything, doing something kind. The losses had shaped him. Some of them had shaped him in ways that were genuinely limiting. The difficulty trusting, the retreat into performance, the wine as buffer. But they had also contributed to something else, a kind of durability, a tested quality. The particular resilience that comes not from never having been broken, but from having been broken and discovered that the breaking, while very bad, was survivable. He didn't celebrate this. He wasn't that kind of person. But it was there, underneath everything, as a kind of foundation. He had been hurt by things that should have destroyed him, and he was still here. What did Tyrion Lannister actually believe? Not politically. His political views shift and adapt and are always in service of the immediate situation, which is either a sign of pragmatism or opportunism, depending on how generously you want to read it. And the answer is probably both. But in a deeper sense, what did he believe about the world, about human nature, about whether things could be better, or whether the machinery of power would always produce the same results, regardless of who was operating it? He believed that most people were mostly self-interested, most of the time. This was not cynicism exactly. It didn't make him angry or contemptuous, the way cynicism usually does. It was more like a baseline assumption, a starting position from which he could occasionally be pleasantly surprised, rather than a destination he was driving toward. He believed that intelligence was not sufficient. He'd seen that clearly and personally. Being smarter than the people around you, being more competent, understanding the situation more accurately. None of those things guaranteed anything. The world was not fundamentally a meritocracy. It was a series of systems that perpetuated themselves through power and habit, and the very human tendency to mistake familiarity for correctness. He believed in books, in the accumulated wisdom of people who had thought carefully about things and written the thoughts down. He found genuine solace in the company of dead minds, minds that had understood things and preserved the understanding and sent it forward through time as a gift to whoever came along and needed it. There's something very moving about that, actually. The person who has been failed by most of the living people around them, finding home and companionship in the written thoughts of people who never knew they would need them. He may have believed, underneath everything else, in something close to basic human dignity. Not in a way he would have advertised, not in a way he would have allowed to be used to make him look soft or sentimental, but in the way he responded to the small folk, in the way he consistently, even at personal cost, declined to treat powerless people as simply obstacles or instruments, in the way he noticed when something was wrong and couldn't quite make himself not respond to it. That impulse, the one that notices injustice and can't entirely look away, is a form of belief, not articulated, not systematized, just present, just operating. He also believed, I think, in some version of the following, that the best you could do was try to leave things marginally less terrible than you found them. Not to save anyone, not to fix the system, not to achieve any grand transformation, just to be, in whatever position you happen to occupy, someone who noticed what was actually happening and made decisions accordingly, who didn't lie to themselves about what the situation was, who brought their full intelligence to bear on the actual problem rather than the official version of the problem. That's a modest belief, a sustainable one. It doesn't require faith in human perfectibility or historical progress or the ultimate triumph of good over evil. It just requires showing up, paying attention, and he managed it imperfectly across a life full of conditions that made trying very difficult. Let's step back from Westeros for a while. Let's come somewhere closer, somewhere without dragons or great castles or elaborate political hierarchies with their own intricate terminology. Let's come to the ordinary world, the one you live in, the one that is running quietly outside the room you're in right now, with all its machinery and its systems and its own versions of all the dynamics we've been talking about. Because everything we've been discussing is here too. The person who was born into the wrong family, in the wrong body, with the wrong name, and spent their childhood figuring out how to survive that. The person who developed extraordinary social intelligence as a direct consequence of being placed in situations where social intelligence was a matter of survival. The person who made themselves funny because funny was safer than honest, at least in the short term. The person who drank or worked or ran or disappeared into something because the alternative was to sit with what they actually felt, and sitting with what they actually felt was something they hadn't yet learned to do safely. Those people are not in Westeros. They are at your job. They are in your family. They might be sitting across from you at dinner right now, performing the very performance we've been describing, without either of you fully knowing that's what's happening. The psychological configuration we've been following, the acute external intelligence, the internal blind spots, the humor as armor, the deep hunger for genuine connection beneath the performance of not needing it, is not rare. It is, in fact, extremely common, possibly more common than its opposite, possibly more common than the clean, secure, received kind of psychology that develops when the early conditions are right. Because the early conditions are frequently not right. Most people are raised by people who were themselves raised by people who were themselves carrying wounds. The wounds passed down, not as malice. Most parents are not malicious in the way that Tywin was malicious, but as pattern, as the only available model for how to be a parent, which was to be parented the way you were parented, which carries forward whatever was broken in Matt. The child who grows up being told, explicitly or implicitly, that they are too much or not enough, or the wrong kind, that child adapts, develops the compensating intelligence, builds the armor, makes the jokes, learns to be useful as a substitute for being wanted, comes to understand in their body before they can name it in their mind that their survival depends on reading the room correctly, every time, without fail, without rest. And then they go up, and they are very perceptive and very capable, and frequently very funny, and privately often very tired. And the world tends to reward the perceptive, capable, funny parts, while not noticing the tired part at all, because the tired part is well hidden, because they became excellent at hiding it before they became anything else. You might know this person, you might be this person, not necessarily in the full, acute version that Tyrion represents. He is, by design, an extreme case, a distillation, but in some proportion, some mixture that includes some of these ingredients in some quantities. Most of us carry more of this than we tend to acknowledge. And the thing that's worth saying slowly, so it has time to be heard, is that the adaptation is not a flaw. The armor is not a character weakness. The particular intelligence that developed out of particular difficulty is not something to be ashamed of, or pathologized, or fixed. It is a response, a rational, creative, genuinely intelligent response to difficult conditions. And responses can evolve, not easily, not all at once, not without some version of the willingness to sit in the room with what's actually there, which is always a little frightening, and sometimes very frightening, and occasionally devastating, but eventually possible. Eventually possible. Let's return to Tywin for a moment, because the relationship between Tyrion and his father is not just one thread in the story. It is the central thread, the one that everything else is wound around. Tywin Lannister was, in many ways, extraordinary. This is worth acknowledging, even though it complicates the easy story, where he is simply the villain, and Tyrion is simply the victim. Because the easy story, while not wrong, is not complete. Tywin built something remarkable. He took a family that had declined, that had squandered resources and status, and the particular kind of credibility that comes from being seen to exercise power responsibly, and rebuild it from near collapse into the dominant force in the political story, landscape of his world. He did this through intelligence and ruthlessness, and a kind of focused, unrelenting will that is genuinely impressive in the scope of what it accomplished. He was also, by most available evidence, a man in significant private pain, not the kind of pain he would have allowed to be visible, not the kind of pain he would have acknowledged, even to himself, but pain nonetheless. He had loved his wife, genuinely loved her, which was not a given in his world, and was perhaps not even a given for him, who was not constituted for easiness in relationships. And she was gone. And something in him that might have been warmer or more flexible or more capable of actual human connection had gone with her, or had been so thoroughly locked down in the aftermath of her loss that it amounted to the same thing. He managed the pain the way powerful men manage pain, which is to say, he didn't manage it at all. He metabolized it into ambition, into the relentless construction of legacy, into the cultivation of his golden children, Cersei, Jaime, as extensions of himself and his vision, as the proofs that the Lannister name meant something, that his life had been worth the cost. And then there was Tyrion, the one who didn't fit the proof, who disrupted it just by existing. Tywin's failure was not that he was cruel. It was that he was incapable, genuinely incapable, of separating the person of his youngest son from the symbolic problem that person represented. He never saw Tyrion clearly. He saw the defect. He saw the disruption. He saw the thing that didn't fit. And in 40 years of coexistence, he never managed to look past that to the actual human being who was looking back at him. That failure cost both of them enormously. Tyrion spent his life wanting, in some very private and rarely acknowledged part of himself, for his father to see him just once, to look past the body and the symbolic problem and see the mind, the humor, the genuine care, the authentic Lannister qualities, the intelligence, the strategic thinking, the refusal to be destroyed, that Tyrion absolutely possessed, that he had arguably developed more fully than either of his siblings, that could have been the basis for a real relationship if Tywin had been capable of that relationship. He never got it. And the wanting of it, that persistent, unanswerable, lifelong longing for paternal recognition, shaped everything. It was the negative space in the center of his psychological architecture, the empty room around which all the other rooms were arranged. This too is recognizable, perhaps especially recognizable, given how many people carry some version of the unavailable parent. The parent who was physically present, but emotionally elsewhere, who gave resources but not warmth, who had high expectations but low capacity for actual seeing, whose love, when it existed, arrived with conditions attached that were never fully articulated and therefore could never be fully met. The longing for that parent's actual recognition is one of the most persistent and quietly painful experiences in human psychology. It doesn't resolve just because you grow up. It doesn't dissolve just because you intellectually understand that the parent's unavailability was their limitation and not your failing. The longing continues. The checking, the monitoring for signs that maybe this time, in this interaction, something real will happen. And then, very often, it doesn't. And you go back to the line, or the books, or the work, or whatever your version of the cup is, and you keep going. The night is very late now. The thoughts have been moving for a while. Let them begin to slow. Not because we've arrived anywhere conclusive. We haven't. And I think that's appropriate. Because the kinds of things we've been sitting with don't resolve into conclusions. But because slowing down is its own kind of arriving. You can stop in the middle of something and rest there. That is allowed. Let's ask some questions. Not questions that require answers. Questions that just deserve to exist in the air for a moment. What would it mean to see someone correctly? Not to agree with everything they do. Not to excuse their failures or minimize their damage, or pretend that the complicated parts of them aren't complicated, but to actually see them. To hold in your mind simultaneously the intelligence and the damage, the generosity and the self-destruction, the genuine love and the difficulty receiving it, the extraordinary capacity and the ordinary, deeply ordinary hunger for warmth. What would it mean for someone to see you that way? Not as what you represent to them, not as a function you serve, or a problem you present, or a feeling you produce in them, but as the actual, specific configuration of everything you are, including the parts that haven't been resolved yet, the parts that are still unfinished, the parts that the public version of you has learned to smooth over, because the public version knows the public can't quite handle the unsmoothed version. What would it feel like to be received that way? These are not rhetorical questions. Or rather, they are questions that don't need to be answered aloud or in words. They are questions whose value is in the sitting with them, in the small, private movement that happens somewhere inside when you let the question land rather than deflect it. Tyrion never fully received that kind of seeing from the world around him. He received approximations. Jaime, who came closest. Jaime, who came closer. Certain relationships that were real within their limits. Moments, brief, unannounced, over before they could be cataloged. When something genuine passed between him and another person, and the armor was just momentarily beside the point. He treasured those moments, not loudly, not in the way he would have allowed to be observed. But you could tell in the way his face moved in those moments that they were different from everything else, that they landed somewhere real. I think most people have a list like that, a private catalog of moments when they were genuinely seen, when the reception was accurate and something settled briefly in a way that it mostly doesn't. And the list is worth tending to, worth knowing, worth occasionally taking out and looking at, because it is evidence that the seeing is possible, that it has happened, that you are the kind of thing that can be seen. Whatever happened in the spaces between those moments, whatever absence or misreading or structural hostility made the moments feel exceptional rather than ordinary, none of that changes what the moments themselves demonstrate. You can be seen You have been seen. Early in our time together tonight, we spoke about it. We spoke about a man sitting alone in a side room of a great castle, a cup in his hand, the torches low, the castle breathing around him with the particular slow patience of old stone. Let's return to that image in the sea. But let's turn it slightly, the way you turn a stone to find the different facets. The man in the side room is not hiding. That's the first thing to notice. He is not towering or retreating or running away from anything. He is, in his own way, exactly where he wants to be. The side room is the right room. The quiet is the right quiet. The cup gives his hands something to do, yes, but the cup is also just genuinely pleasant. Good wine. After a long day of performing, the pleasure of something simple and unconditional. He is not sad, exactly. Not in this moment. He is in that other state, the one that doesn't have a good name, that is close to melancholy but quieter than melancholy, less directed. The state of someone who has been very busy for a long time and has briefly stopped, and in the stopping is becoming aware of all the things that the busyness was keeping him from feeling. It's not a bad state, actually. Uncomfortable sometimes, but also strangely honest. Nothing is being managed in that state. Nothing is being performed. The room doesn't need anything from him. The cup doesn't need anything from him. The slow sound of the castle settling against the cold doesn't need anything from him. He can just be the actual thing he is for a few minutes. Not the hand of the king, not the Lannister embarrassment, not the sharp-tongued survivor, just the particular person who emerged from all of those conditions and is still against several significant odds. Here, there's a kind of peace in that. I want to stay with that peace for a while. Because I think it's important and underemphasized that the story of Tyrion Lannister is not only a story of suffering and adaptation and the toll of a life spent navigating hostile conditions. It is also the story of someone who found in the interstices of all of that genuine pleasure, genuine engagement, the real and unreduced joy of a mind that genuinely loves to think, finding material worthy of it. The real and unreduced pleasure of good wine, or a well-timed joke, or a moment of genuine human exchange that breaks through the transactional surface of political life and becomes something warmer. He was not only suffering, he was also intermittently living. That matters. It matters because it's true, and because the true version of a complicated life is more interesting than the simplified version. And because the simplified version, he was a tragic figure. His life was defined by his pain, is itself a misreading of the same family as all the other misreadings that defined his life. He was a person, a full, specific, complicated, occasionally happy, often tired, deeply intelligent, imperfectly loving person. The pain was real, the suffering was real, and the laughter was also real. And the book he was reading and couldn't put down at midnight was also real, and the genuine, warm animal pleasure of a cup of wine by low firelight was also real. All of it, simultaneously, was real. That's what people are. All of it, simultaneously, real. We've talked about armor throughout this journey. The wit, the performance, the preemptive self-deprecation. Let's go deeper into what the armor was protecting, because that part tends to be less visible. Underneath the armor of Tyrion Lannister, there was a person who hoped. That's the simplest way to say it, and maybe the truest. Underneath all the calibrated cynicism, all the strategic clarity about how people worked and what the world was like, and why optimism was generally unwarranted, there was someone who kept hoping, who kept extending, despite everything, the provisional faith that this time might be different. This situation was person. This alignment of circumstances might produce something other than what circumstances had produced before. He hoped for connection, for genuine, mutual, unconditional connection, of the kind that Jaime had given him early, and that he spent the rest of his life looking for the echo of. He hoped for recognition, to be seen, as we've discussed, in the full and accurate version of what he was. He hoped in certain darker hours for something even simpler than recognition, just for presence, for company, for the particular comfort of not being alone in the room where the thoughts were loudest. Not needing the other person to say anything profound or to understand perfectly or to solve any problem. Just there. The persistent, unkillable, frequently disappointed hope is the tender center of him. The thing the armor was protecting. The thing that, if it had been fully exposed for too long, might have been damaged beyond repair. He kept it protected, carefully. Almost too carefully, sometimes. The protection became so comprehensive that it occasionally prevented the thing it was protecting from functioning. The armor kept out not just the threatening things, but also the good things. The genuine warmth that occasionally arrived without an agenda. The real care that occasionally extended itself in his direction. The moments that could have been received as the thing he needed. If the armor had been just slightly more porous. But you can't criticize the armor for being what it was. It was built for specific conditions. It was calibrated precisely and correctly to the threats it had encountered. If it occasionally over-applied itself, if it occasionally blocked out things that weren't threats, that is the predictable overshoot of any sufficiently robust defense system. You build it to handle the worst case, and sometimes the worst case doesn't come, and the armor is there anyway. He knew this about himself. In the unsentimental way of someone who has made a study of human behavior, including their own, he could see the mechanism operating, could identify the moments when the armor was unnecessary, could sometimes, with considerable effort, override it just enough to let something through. Those moments cost him something. They left him briefly exposed in ways that were uncomfortable and sometimes dangerous, but they were also in their strange exposed way, the moments he was most fully alive, the moments when the cup was set down and the wit was quiet and something real was happening. This is perhaps the most delicate subject we've touched on tonight, and I want to approach it carefully. There is a version of Tyrion's story that is, on some level, deeply satisfying. The overlooked one who proves his worth. The person dismissed by the world who turns out to be more capable, more thoughtful, more genuinely moral than the people who dismissed it. The narrative arc of recognition, not complete recognition, not clean redemption, not a fairy tale, but enough to constitute a kind of justice. The story gives him glimpses of that, moments when his competence is undeniable, when even his enemies have to acknowledge, at least privately, that whatever they think of him, he has just done something that none of them could have done. The Battle of Blackwater. The management of the city during the crisis. The specific, recurring capacity to read a situation with clarity when everyone around him is reading it through the distorting lenses of their own interests and fears. Those moments are real and they're satisfying, and they represent something genuine. He earned them. They were not given. But the story also does something less satisfying, which is more realistic. It shows, again and again, that competence and recognition don't automatically translate into each other. That the gap between what you actually do and how you are perceived for it can remain stubbornly wide, regardless of how much evidence accumulates. That the people who have decided what you are tend to maintain that decision in the face of significant counter-evidence, because changing it would require them to acknowledge that they were wrong, and acknowledging that you were wrong about a person, really wrong, comprehensively wrong in ways that caused real damage, is among the most difficult things human beings are capable of doing. Almost no one in Tyrion's life acknowledged that they were wrong about him. Some came close. Some moments of something that might have been acknowledgement passed between characters, quickly, without the direct statement. But the full acknowledgement, the explicit, unhidden recognition that he had been misread, and the misreading had cost him, and the people who did the misreading bore responsibility for that cost. That did not arrive. It rarely does, in real life either. And so you were left holding the competence and the recognition gap and the persistent hope that doesn't quite die, and the wine and the wit and the continuing, daily, exhausting practice of being in a world that doesn't entirely know what to do with you. And you keep going because that's the option. Because the alternative to keeping going is not keeping going. And Tyrion, in every situation, in every impossible corner, in every moment where the rational calculation would have suggested that this was the time to stop, chose to keep going. That is not a small thing. It is perhaps the largest thing. Very late now. The thoughts are growing slower. Let them. Let's do a quiet inventory, not of events or characters or plot, a quieter inventory. of what we've sat with tonight. We've sat with the experience of being born into conditions that didn't fit, of discovering early that the world had a shape and you were not quite the right shape for it, and adapting to that discovery with whatever resources were available. We've sat with the particular intelligence that develops in people who cannot afford to misread a room, the hypervigilance dressed up as social grace, the survival skill masquerading as charm. We've sat with humor as armor, as processing tool, as genuine gift given freely to the people around you who needed it. We sat with the voice of the father, or the mother, or the institution, or the culture, or whichever early authority delivered the message, saying something that was wrong, but was delivered with sufficient authority and repetition to feel like truth. And with the ongoing, lifelong work of distinguishing that voice from your own.